I know many journalists at many of the major media outlets who are trans who are not allowed to cover trans issues. We see debates on transgender issues or we see silence on transgender issues. But what we don't see is a trans person sitting on CNN talking about the laws that they're talking about. We often don't see transgender people directly referenced or spoken to.
Coming to you live from the swamp, the Gilmore Show. And we're back with another great interview. I'm starting to turn into some kind of Barbara Walters. Look at me. Ha ha, yeah. A great gator-sized greeting to all of you. Today's guest, Erin Reed, an activist, a journalist, and a D&D dungeon master. Ho ho ho, yeah. Well, hello.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
Let's get right to it. Across the United States, trans rights are under attack. And though people might be broadly aware of the landscape, could you take us through some of the state-level legislation that is emblematic of what this attack looks like?
Of course. So, over the last 3 years, I have tracked over 1,000 bills targeting LGBTQ people, and the vast majority of which are specifically targeting transgender people. Some of these bills, for instance, ban us from bathrooms in accordance with our gender identity. And if I use the same bathroom in the state of Florida that I have used for many years now, I could be arrested and charged with trespassing and thrown in jail for up to a year. Some of these bills force transgender youth who have been stable in their gender identity for years to medically detransition. It pulls them off of their care and bans anybody from that care moving forward. So you might have, for instance, a young transgender girl who's 17 years old who has been on estrogen and who is now forced to medically detransition to grow a beard in front of her classmates. It's pretty terrifying what some of these kids are having to go through in these states. Some of these bills ban books about LGBTQ people and LGBTQ stories, from our works of fiction to our own autobiographies. Some ban trans people from performing in any way. Things like drag bans, for instance, state that you cannot perform on a stage if your assigned sex at birth is different from the gender identity that you're performing if it is in public. And these bills, they define drag as using elaborate makeup or clothing to signify gender identity. And congratulations, you just banned Dolly Parton. You just banned glam rock. You just banned pro wrestling, the Dallas Cowboys cheerleading squad. Actually, there's a really interesting one. In Arkansas, the bill failed because one of the Democrats brought up that this bill would ban Hooters. And suddenly everybody in the committee that it was heard in suddenly had no interest in banning drag by defining it the way that they did. Some of these bills, they ban trans participation in sports, which is a loaded and potentially contentious topic to be sure, but let's talk about how some of these sports bans are actually enforced and how they work. For instance, we see that the vast majority of challenges against people in these sports bans end up being against cisgender women athletes by parents who are part of the losing team. We just saw this in Utah, where there were public officials who accused a cisgender teenage girl on a basketball team of being trans. And there was a huge outrage about it. And then they discovered that no, this girl was cisgender. She was assigned female at birth. She's been female her whole life. And, we see that kind of enforcement. Some of these sports bans also ban or target transgender women in sports like women's darts, disc golf, pool, fishing. That's a new one. And let me tell you, I promise you that as a trans woman myself, if I cast a line with an estradiol pill at the end of it into the water, fish are not going to come biting, and I'm not going to start catching fish that way. We see transgender bans in beauty pageants and even the incredibly gendered and athletic sport of chess. That is a new one. Women's Chess, FIDE, the International Organization in Chess, ruled that transgender women have no right to compete in women's chess. This is right immediately after Yosha Iglesias became the first woman international master in chess who is transgender. Thankfully, this is not being broadly enforced in the chess world. But this just goes to show that, I want you to actually think, I want your listeners to think about what it means to say that transgender women have a biological advantage in chess. They're literally trying to say that transgender women are smarter. And that's actually not what they're trying to say. If you actually get down to the gritty of it, if you understand these people's philosophy, they believe that transgender women are actually men and that men are actually smarter and have a biological advantage at intelligence. Now, there have been studies on chess, and 96% of all of the differences in scoring in chess comes because there are vastly more male chess players than female chess players. The field has been extremely misogynistic towards female chess players. There's an entire Netflix series on this. And so, yeah, we are seeing, all in all, about 25 states have explicit anti-LGBTQ laws on the books in this latest wave of the Rainbow Scare. And that is the current landscape that we are living in.
The U.S. Department of Education just released the new Title IX rules, which specifically protect students against discrimination based on sexual identity and gender identity, and that trans students may not be denied access to bathroom consistent with their gender identity. States with laws already on the books to discriminate against trans students, like Florida, Iowa, and Oklahoma, are now suing the department to overturn the new rules. How do you see this playing out, and do you think students in these particular states will continue being harmed while the lawsuits make their way through the courts?
Yes, so just to give your listeners some background, Title IX forbids discrimination in the school environment based on sex. And the reason why transgender people are protected by Title IX, the reason why there's a current understanding around trans protections in Title IX is actually because of a ruling that happened in 2021. It's called Bostock versus Clayton County. And this was not about Title IX, it was about Title VII. Title VII is just like Title IX, but instead of applying to schools, it applies to workplaces. And it forbids sex discrimination in the workplace. And so what happened is there were a few people. One of them was a transgender woman who was fired from her job for dressing as a woman. And this made it all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled 6-3, with Neil Gorsuch, the conservative justice, writing the opinion that discrimination against transgender people is sex discrimination under Title VII, and that transgender people cannot be fired for being trans or for presenting as female or for presenting as whatever their gender identity is. And that had a ripple effect, because whenever you look at other laws that have the exact same wording as Title VII, gender and sex and whatnot, we find that Title IX likely also protects in the exact same way. Now, the way that you understand how federal rulemaking works is that even though many courts have ruled that Title IX applies to trans people, the federal government still has to explicitly say how they're going to enforce it and whatnot. And so they made a rule very recently that says that they are going to comply with all the court cases that say that Title IX applies to trans people, and that gender identity and discrimination on gender identity is sex discrimination. And so we now are seeing several states say that I'm just not going to listen to the federal government. Forget preemption, forget the fact that the federal government should preempt state laws. I'm just not going to listen at all. The states that came out saying that were Louisiana, Florida, I believe South Carolina was one of them. Texas recently came out and said it as well. And so there are a handful of states that have come out and said that they're going to ignore the federal government on this. Now, what they are hoping for is they're hoping that they can get in through one of their pet conservative judges. We know, for instance, in the Northern District of Texas, it's one of the favorite places where they like to file. We know that they're going to draw one of essentially two judges, and both of those judges are extremely anti-trans, extremely far-right. One of them, for instance, is Judge Kasmark, who is responsible for the mifepristone abortion pill ruling, who's responsible for a lot of the biggest rulings over conservative pet causes. And so this is going to go through the courts. I anticipate that one of these conservative judges is going to block Title IX implementation. It's probably going to go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And, that's what we're all waiting for. We're waiting to see what happens whenever it gets to the Supreme Court.
The most vociferous anti-trans voices are on the right, to be sure. But how can you situate the response of people outside of the right when it comes to trans rights? Like, for example, the Democratic Party, the New York Times, and the Biden administration. How has their response measured up?
Yeah, so I think that it's important to sort of segregate out each one of these groups of people that are outside of the far right and talk about them individually. One of the issues that we have right now with, say, our major media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, all of the major outlets out there, is that they tend to explicitly or implicitly not feature transgender writers, transgender people. I know many journalists at many of the major media outlets who are trans, who are not allowed to cover trans issues. I know many very good trans writers have submitted op-eds to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, to all of the different outlets out there, and consistently get denied coverage, consistently get denied the ability to get their voice out in print. And it's the same thing for our major national television outlets. We see debates on transgender issues, or we see silence on transgender issues. But what we don't see is a trans person sitting on CNN talking about the laws that they're talking about. We often don't see transgender people directly referenced or spoken to. And so I think that's one of the biggest issues. Another issue is that they are, especially in the opinion sections right now, platforming some of the worst and really just letting them say whatever they want and letting them, spout off a lot of completely untrue statements. Very recently, the Pamela Paul piece, for instance, in the New York Times is 4,500 words long. It took up 2 full pages of the New York Times. It was published in the opinion section, and it looked like a in-depth investigative journalism piece. I suspect because potentially they were going to try to make it an investigative journalism piece and it couldn't pass fact check. That's just my own suspicion. I don't have any proof of that. But what I will note is that it was a litany of every single just fallacious claim about transgender people. Everything from 80% of trans people are going to regret that they transitioned, which is just not true at all. There's no research showing that. Um, and more, things like trans care is dangerous, or trans care is something that people grow out of. Uh, and so these are all things that people very quickly jumped on. I jumped on myself. I wrote a long fact check of the article that thankfully got viewed millions of times. And um, and so we do face issues outside of the far right in sort of discussing validity of transgender rights. And I will also note that the reason why we see those issues is specifically being purposefully engineered by the far right. The groups that are being cited as the impartial experts on trans care, the ones who oppose trans care, that is, people like the Society for Evidence in Gender Medicine, or GenSpect, or any number of the American College of Pediatricians, which is a fake named group meant to confuse you with the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is the actual big medical organization. You have all of these fake sounding organizations that essentially are being paid with Koch money or through Koch funded industries and Koch funded philanthropy or organizations. And so, we do have a major laundering of anti-trans disinformation through major media outlets using very subversive tactics. As far as Democrats go, I think that I will actually give most Dems in the United States credit for not turning on queer people and trans people and LGBTQ people, in the sense that I cover all of the legislative hearings, I cover all of the votes, and in virtually every state, with a rare couple of exceptions, Democrats have held firm against anti-trans legislation. And even very recently, in the national budget fight, we know that Republicans were attempting to hold the budget hostage on the backs of transgender people. They had 50 anti-trans and anti-queer provisions that they wanted to put into the budget bill that would have barred gender-affirming care nationwide in many ways. Thankfully, virtually none of those made it through. The only one that made it through was a pride flag ban that was only on flagpoles at embassies. The embassies can still hang the flags in their windows. They can still personally have flags and whatnot. And so, I think that the real issue with Democrats, that I think a lot of transgender people are frustrated with, is that it feels like they could do more. It feels like there is more that they can do. It feels like, we've seen major asks of prominent Democrats on things like reversing the Florida driver's license ban, where in Florida they are currently revoking driver's licenses of trans people and giving their old licenses back. And every single congressional Democrat, this is to the United States Congress, wrote a letter to Biden asking him to enforce the Real ID Act against Florida, to basically say that their IDs were out of compliance because the Real ID Act specifically requires gender on the driver's license. And so, we have some issues on that front. But all in all, like, Dems have held pretty steady on opposing anti-trans laws. And in fact, we recently saw the ones that have held steady have been rewarded on that. We saw in the 2023 elections, 70% of Moms for Liberty candidates lost their races. We saw some of the same people that won the races who were running in opposition to Moms for Liberty candidates swear in on the same books that the previous group had banned. We even saw in, for instance, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a bellwether county, where on election night, if you watch CNN, you're going to see them focus in on Bucks County, Pennsylvania. As goes Bucks County, so goes the nation. It's one of those bellwether counties. And, Moms for Liberty candidates lost by and large in that race. And the two that had held their seats, whenever they realized that they had no real power to ban books anymore, they all resigned the very next day. And it's because they didn't care about teacher retention. They didn't care about, grade point averages or absenteeism, like the things that you work together regardless of what party you're in. Whenever it comes to school boards are traditionally nonpartisan because people can generally agree that we want good teachers, we want, invested students and whatnot. But no, they resigned the very next day because they couldn't ban their books anymore. And so, yeah, I think all in all, that would be my assessment of the landscape outside of the far right.
People engaged in anti-trans legislation and rhetoric are quick to lean on statistical outliers and deny the voluminous mainstream science on things like, say, the efficacy of gender-affirming care. Could you talk a little bit about what that looks like and why it might be the case that they're completely comfortable leaning on junk science?
Of course. I mean, so part of it is that they're going to interpret anything as negative. It can be the most positive finding in the world, and they will find a way to say this actually proves that trans people are unhealthy and bad. So let me give you an example. There are recent studies that have shown that regret rate for transgender people is incredibly low. The U.S. Transgender Survey of 2022 showed that for transgender people who have obtained hormone therapy, the regret rate is under 1%. And so we saw in the very heavily editorialized WPATH files leak from one of the far right people who was pushing a lot of anti-trans disinformation, that whenever they see a study like that, rather than do what I think most reasonable people would do and read that study and say, oh, okay, I guess like trans people know who they are and trans people are happy with their decisions and they know themselves, something that I think intuitively people who know trans people understand that, or trans people themselves understand that. But no, that's not where they went with that. That's not how they understood that statistic. Instead, they had this big section called transgender people are suspiciously happy. And that literally low regret rates should not be a sign that trans people understand who they are and that trans people are happy with their decisions, but rather that transgender people are deluded, or that transgender people they've bought into this identity and they really secretly want to escape it, but they can't say it. So they answer that we're all so happy, but inside it's killing us. That's not the case. There's no evidence of this. But this is exactly what I'm talking about. They look at this and they will interpret it in a way that means that trans people are just bad and wrong and unhealthy, and that our care should be banned. Another example is in that Pamela Paul piece, I believe, they referenced, and in even I think the Cass review recently in England, they referenced that trans people desist. That means that they stop identifying as trans. That their rate of desistance is only 2.5% in a recent study. They saw that number. They said, okay, so wait, trans people who socially transition They continue identifying as trans 5 years later as youth. And so, that should be, to anybody reasonable, they should say, oh, okay, so that means that trans people, they tend to know who they are. They transition, and 5 years, whenever you look at them 5 years down the line, they're still trans. They still identify who they are as who they are. The rate of non-identification 5 years later is only 2.5%. And so what places like the Cass Review said is that no, what's actually happening here is that trans people are being locked into their gender identity by socially transitioning. And that actually, by socially transitioning, they feel like they can't escape, and that now they're stuck as being trans. There's no evidence of this. The Cass Review had ample opportunity to talk to trans youth, and they didn't find anybody who said that they felt stuck, like they felt like they were forced to transition because they had already transitioned. They were forced to continue identifying as trans. I think that we hear the least charitable interpretations of everything. Another really good example is the idea that puberty blockers cause bone loss, that your bones are going to melt out of your body if you're trans. And what we had this entire New York Times article about bone density, and it was a lot of scare tactics that puberty blockers are causing people to lose their bone density. WPATH had to issue a correction to the New York Times stating that, hey, look, it's actually the case that we just give our trans youth calcium. That's it. It just takes a calcium supplement, a little chocolate calcium chew. And so I think that again and again and again, there is no science that's going to be satisfactory for them. There's nothing that's going to be satisfying. They will ideologically oppose transgender care. And in fact, if you look at some of the organizations for which the members belong to who are leading this charge, we see places like the Catholic Medical Association, whose representative, one of the people from the Catholic Medical Association, Patrick Hunter, was responsible for the Florida gender affirming caravan. And if you look into the Catholic Medical Association, there's specifically a section that says that you cannot find that trans care saves lives. You're forbidden from that finding. I think that we are going to continue to see, no matter what evidence that we throw at them, that trans people are happy and that we know who we are. And they're going to continue to make the most uncharitable reading of everything.
It might be the case that they aren't interested in an evidence-based approach.
Absolutely not. And it's all about how they will ignore all of the evidence in favor of their own conclusions.
Yeah. Listen, I want to talk a bit about stochastic terrorism and the very real threat of violence from online figures like libs of TikTok. Can you first maybe talk a bit about what stochastic terrorism is, and can you talk about what this looks like and how what happens online doesn't just stay online and results in real-world harms?
Absolutely. So just to give your readers an idea of what stochastic terrorism is, it's the idea that you can basically call a shot and you know that your audience is going to take it. The very classic version of stochastic terrorism comes from a Shakespeare play where a character says, well, nobody rid me of this meddlesome priest, speaking to a group of people that are going to do the king's bidding. And so the idea is that you don't have to directly tell your audience to go and kill somebody. You don't have to directly tell your audience to send in bomb threats to somebody. If you know that your audience is going to do it anyway, and you can say it, then they're going to do it. And so we see this especially with people like Kaya Rychek in Libs of TikTok, where 50-something bomb threats have followed whenever she's posted individual things on, say, like Boston Children's Hospital or Kiel, Wisconsin, a school district in Kiel, Wisconsin, or Planet Fitness. And, we even saw she was like, things are about to get worse for Planet Fitness. And then after she said that, 40 bomb threats go into Planet Fitness across the country. And, she'll say, and she'll often even threaten lawsuit on this. She'll say that she's being unfairly accused and that she never told anybody to give bomb threats or anything like that. But whenever a newspaper came out from USA Today that says libs of TikTok posts and bomb threats follow, she posed with it with a giant smile. She changed her banner icons to the libs of TikTok logo with little bomb fuses on them. She knows what she's doing. And that's what stochastic terrorism is. This infiltrates, I think, anybody who's active in this fight's life. For me, it has come out in the sense that, I have had um, threats to my life. I have had SWAT teams called on my house before, as has many people that I know personally. Unfortunately, this is the landscape that many trans people have to deal with, and many cisgender people who care for trans people have to deal with. In Boston, we saw that an entire children's hospital ward was shut down for like 8 hours. And, that affects trans and cis people alike. We see libraries shut down. We see school districts get bomb threats for a month and have to go virtual. This is what we are dealing with right now over trans issues.
Think of the children. Oh, Erin, listen, I always like to end with something hopeful. So I'm hoping we could talk about what a successful model might look like for not just pushing back these rights rollbacks, but actually expanding trans rights in the United States.
Immediately after the legislature took control, the Democrats took control of the legislature in Michigan. They got the trifecta there. They got the state house, the state senate, and the governorship by only like a single vote. They passed a state level version of the Equality Act, which explicitly says in the law that you cannot discriminate against sexual orientation or gender identity. And that is going to be used to protect trans health care throughout the state from anybody, really. And we are seeing initiatives like that pop up around the United States right now. We are seeing, in some places, the promotion of and the funding of clinics for trans people who often have a lot of difficulty obtaining their care. We see in some states the building up of healthcare infrastructure for people who are fleeing states like Florida and Ohio and Alabama to get their care in places like Colorado or in Pittsburgh or in Illinois. And so I think that, for transgender people right now, ensuring that we do not make the same mistakes that were made during the fight for abortion rights, where we think that just because we get a court case that secures our victory, we can not have to pass anything into law. Because we all know that as soon as the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade went down, about 24 states suddenly lost their abortion access. And so I think that, we need to codify protections into law in as many places as possible, in as many states as possible. Many states have already begun doing so. The other thing that I'll note is that even in places where we have strong legal protections, many people have trouble accessing those protections. And what we really need is, my fiance, Representative Zoe Zephyr out of Montana, she was a major advocate for a civil rights navigator position within like local city councils. And these are people who you can go to for free to help deal with filing a civil rights complaint against a landlord that doesn't want you to live there anymore because you transitioned, or a civil rights complaint against a school board who has now banned you from using the bathroom. So these sort of civil rights navigator positions are really important. The last thing that I'll say is that even if everything goes well for transgender people in some of these states, intersectionality is also really important. We got to stand up for one another, like Indigenous people, people who are disabled, people who, there are so many different aspects of intersectional work here, especially in reproductive health care. And in fact, in many of these states, the people that are doing the most work on transgender rights are often some of the reproductive health care people, the people that have been running the abortion funds and helping people get out of Texas to get their abortions. They're doing the same thing for trans people as well. So I think that, really taking proactive steps to codify non-discrimination protections and to help people travel across state lines if they need to is going to be really important.
Erin Reed, thank you for illuminating me and my audience. You are awesome. Let's hope everyone can live in liberty and justice for all. Oh, and roll for initiative. Ha 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 ha.